And I'll start with Frank. Frank Ling is chief scientist at Anthropocene Institute. He's also a guest lecturer at Tokyo Institute of Technology and Ibaraki University, and was previously a research fellow at the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies and University of Tokyo. Frank consulted for various organizations, including Asian Development Bank and Jain Capital Partners. His work has been cited in the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change in a special report on global warming. So very, very interesting background. And he's an editor of the cleantech.org and cleantech blog websites and producer and host of science podcast Grok Science. So guys, if you want to know more, just Google the podcast. We have very fantastic content there. Elina Teplinsky is the next speaker. She's a global energy industry leader and partner at Pillsbury law firm, where she is trusted advisor to governments, nuclear owner-operators, reactor and equipment suppliers, investors, architect engineering companies, and other complex nuclear transactional and regulatory matters. So you can see the scope of expertise Elina carries, and that's a very unique perspective. Elina frequently serves as lead outside counsel on new build projects, equipment and fuel procurements, M&A transactions, and joint ventures in the nuclear sector. She worked on transactions for the moment for more than 30 countries. And she's a member of the Strategic Advisory Group of the International Bank for Nuclear Infrastructure Implementation Organization. And we will talk more about this unique organization and their programs that many countries could benefit, and we can deploy more nuclear with that. The next speaker is Dail Sinclair, and she has over 25 years of experience as Chief Investment Officer, Business Advisor, NASDAQ Board Director. She managed several global businesses with P&L responsibilities and serves on several companies' boards, including Verde Clean Fuels, as an independent board director and audit committee member. She co-founded Williams Capital. This is the largest women-led and minority-owned broker-dealer investment bank in the United States. Dail is a Chief Investment Officer at 06, a leading platform to digitize the creation of carbon credits. She experienced in alternative investments and managing highly regulated companies with P&L responsibilities as an energy and utility investment banker and investor. Dail's focus includes reducing methane gas and CO2 emissions. She has demonstrated track record of climate advocacy and using emerging technologies, including AI. So this is very hot topics, especially in energy sector. So those are different topics she covers. And last but not the least, Charles Oppenheimer. Charles is leading the Oppenheimer project. And this is a project that's advocating for peaceful use of fission for energy projects and international cooperation for representing the family and values of Robert Oppenheimer. And recently we have movie Oppenheimer, so probably you're familiar with the content and historic persona of Robert Oppenheimer. So I think it's very timely. And Charles' background includes more than 25 years of Silicon Valley tech entrepreneurship, management, and impact investment. So let's clap. Because we really have fantastic panel. And I'll start with the first question and I address it to Frank. So what is the market potential for nuclear investment in current situation?
So in terms of investment, I think maybe one reference is this recent announcement of tripling the amount of nuclear power. So that would be an additional 800 gigawatts of nuclear capacity. And in terms of the overnight cost of building that could range, if we're assuming anywhere from $2 $2,000 per kilowatt to 20,000 using Vogel as a reference, then we're talking about an investment of potentially 1.6 to 16 trillion dollars to meet that target. But even that, I think, pales to the scale that's really needed. So electricity itself, I think, accounts for 17% of greenhouse gas emissions. So if we're tripling in that, that means we're only reducing greenhouse gas emissions by another 3.5% or so. So if you really want to talk about the global decarbonization, then we could go much further, probably even an order of magnitude in terms of the new capacity that's needed. So potentially the market is going to be a lot larger than even what's being announced here at COP28.
Okay. Charles, since you're holding the mic,
Okay.
the next one for you. Why does nuclear deserve more investment focus? And you have some initiatives, so can you tell more about the work you already started and why nuclear now?
Yeah. So it's a very exciting time for nuclear energy. Representing the Oppenheimer family, I love to tie in the values of my grandfather, which was about international cooperation around scientific matters and potential threats. And fission is an example of that, one of the most important things we could cooperate on. And it seems like there's an opening right now where we can rally around that idea that we could get anything done in the world right now. And nuclear energy doesn't have really a science problem as much as a financing and project problem. There's lots of new technology in the pipeline that's exciting, and there is early stage investment, and there's early stage funding for new sources of technology. But what you see, there's different countries, but let's use the US for an example. There's over $300 billion in assets available by the DOE to apply to a project, but the DOE as a government cannot start a plant and finance it all. So even when there's a lot of money there in general, you need some like catalytic investment, and there's a place for bringing together public and private partnership to kick it off at this stage. Not just the long-term investment in technology, which is happening, but projects that once started could make a financial return. And our next two panelists are like the world experts at this, like how you actually finance a plant, and we'll go into some of those efforts. And I'm excited to kind of donate the name to people who could work with me to help raise the capital and say, hey, the Oppenheimer values support this. Let's use it to kind of bring more capital into the space using public and governmental efforts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you. Next question for you, Elina. So what do you think has held U.S. back from more investment into nuclear sector, and what happening in other countries? What held them back?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the U.S., you see, today is fully committed to nuclear, right? I'm in Washington, D.C., and very few things are bipartisan. Nuclear is actually bipartisan. Mm-hmm. But the U.S. does everything with private funding. And outside of the U.S., most countries, nuclear industries are owned by the state. So when the government makes a decision, especially in countries that have money, countries like China, like Russia, they invest the money, they put together 5, 10, 15 years plans, they get things done. In the US, we rely on industry, which in a way is great because it really encourages innovation, and we have so many designs and we have so many technological breakthroughs, but technological breakthroughs don't necessarily lead to projects. So now we're at a place where we need to tie in the technological innovation we have and the political support to try to figure out, kind of to Charles's point, how do we actually implement projects? How do we bring in players that can finance projects, that can develop them in an intelligent and a smart way, the same way that the UE has done, with their government funding and their vision? So that's the challenge that's ahead of us.
That's fantastic. Well, fantastic response, I mean. But the next questions, I think I will address to you, Dail. And that's more about the new initiatives in terms of the environmental justice that government put together with pushing forward and taking into account your background in government funding, management, and having a lot of experience in community development and financing. So how do you think nuclear can play a role in environmental justice aspect? And elaborate a bit more.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for having me here. The opportunity for nuclear energy today, we are in a pivotal moment, and Charles spoke well about where we are today, and that it's not a science problem, and yes, the technology exists to scale what we all know is the cleanest energy source. So knowing that fact and taking it down to specifics with today, and addressing specifically investor capital and economic justice, I've been investing, have the privilege, frankly, of been investing for actually 28 years, using around, and I started my career at New York City Public Pension Fund. New York City Public Pension Fund, back then, it was and is and still is doing what today's world is more widely known as ESG matrix, and it's not new at all. And in the public pension space, and frankly some of the endowment and foundation space, these are investment parameters and matrix that drove investment decisions, for decades. So fast forward today, it's very exciting about the broader scope of knowledge of ESG, and I'm specifically speaking about the E, the S, and the G. The E is driven by climate and nature and biodiversity. The S is very much driven by economic justice, by jobs, by having all stakeholders at the table. And I was particularly excited about what happened this past Saturday, which Elina referenced, with 30 countries, soon to be an additional 20, and the number of LDCs, the number of emerging economies that heretofore have never had a seat at the table. And that was frankly part of the issue. We're drawing uranium, for example, from countries, given that is a core element of nuclear energy, but not having a conversation with the communities and the impact on the communities. So, and the governance, self-explanatory in terms of a structure to do things right. Since 2015, we now have the UN PRI goals, more institutional investors, and quite frankly, more family offices who seek to invest in a similar fashion. I always go back to the UN PRI goals as a baseline, and there's, from that perspective, one can draw from 1, 2, or 3 and always tie in value. So back to financing. Blended financing is topical, and there isn't one investor, any part of the world, where this is not a topic. And if we look at the spectrum of financing, you have 100% philanthropy on one side, 100% financial returns on the other side, and percentages in between. And I can tell you, and maybe most of you know, that 100% financial returns, yes, you also can achieve ESG matrix. So there's no question that you can do both. The question is how much of both. And so I drive back to understanding the risk appetite of the investor, and blended financing, you have a mix of institutions and frankly large family offices. There's some family offices that are larger than endowments and foundations just because of the hundreds of years of wealth, and they are focused on mission-driven investments, sustainable investments. So the education of nuclear energy is the key component, and why I'm so excited that all of you are here and to be speaking with you, because it's the education of nuclear energy, what it can do, what the technology is here. There are dollars seeking these solutions, and so understanding blended financing, understanding that, quite frankly, as a structured finance banker, there's nothing you can everything can be structured. There's nothing that can't be structured at all for any investor. And I won't go into details. Yes, it's complex, but the good news is that there are guys and women and all types of individuals that know how to do that. So the capital is here too, and now it's combining the interest, the capital, the returns. Thank you for your time. I get very much.
Thank you so much. That's not done yet, guys. Another question, that's actually open question for everyone if you want to answer. What are the trends in new kinds of financing that make it easier to find large nuclear projects? And that actually returns to Dail's point on appetites for return and how to make it attractive for long-term investors, like even short-term. Right now we invest short-term, getting into game only if we expect return in a year or 5, but with nuclear it usually takes a decade before we get anything back. So with alternative financing and this like new trends, how we can instill those money coming into nuclear sector, giving those returns coming not so soon. I guess.
I'm happy to start.
Yeah.
So one thing that I'm seeing in my practice, certainly as far as investing into technology and companies developing technology, you're starting to see lots of non-traditional players, sovereign wealth funds, private equity in particular. Private equity would normally never invest into technology before, but there are a number of companies very seriously looking at investors into companies that are, further along, but they still don't have returns coming in for the next couple of years, and that is really because of the energy transition. It's because of the ESG standards. Everybody is under pressure to comply with ESG. They recognize, I think, universally that nuclear needs to be part of the energy transition in order for the energy transition to happen. And because of that, you're having these non-traditional players take more risks than they normally would investing into nuclear, and I think that's very exciting.
Well, I'll just recognize the difficulty level of your question, Dinara, because you said, what are the new trends that are helping finance large nuclear projects? And it's like, that is it's very difficult, right? Like even for nation states, Poland recently has had a great successful large nuclear project, and even them, they put out a small news release, I don't know if you're familiar with that, saying, can somebody come up with another 30% of $20 billion? So it is a difficult thing. UAE did an amazing job. They put all the money down and built a plant. That's innovative. But where can we come in between? The points made on the panel that if we can bring family office money and philanthropic and catalytic and even government to get the next one going and just say, let's put in, $2 billion of the $10 billion to prove that you can do one more large nuclear plant. I would look forward to that kind of vehicle that's in between governments and utilities and can kind of assume more risk.
An example, to directly answer your question, I'll just stick to something more specific, and dovetailing Elena's remark. Blended financing includes a combination of equity as well as loans. So Prosper Africa, which is a U.S. organization and has a mandate to deploy. I don't actually remember the billions in terms of the number, and I like to be specific. But to deploy capital directly on the continent, that's all 51 countries. $3.5 billion. So that I knew Charles would know. The point is, that's one example of a lender. There are many lenders, frankly, globally. Most of them are government sponsored that are looking for homes. Most of them are going to do 5% of first loss. So you have your first loss loan fund that does take away some risk for individuals that don't have that risk appetite. And you combine that with equity investors, and you essentially, as I said before, there's nothing that can't be structured. But I do see opportunities in blended financing, and I do see opportunities with entities like Prosper Africa as addressing part of this gap in terms of financing today, tying it into the benefits of nuclear energy.
So I'll just add a couple of notes. On the ESG aspect, I think one of the challenges has been kind of ambiguity of what that means. And I think some of the efforts to include nuclear as part of that and also into green financing are really encouraging, but I think a bit more needs to be done globally. So that's one thing that our colleagues have been very interested in trying to communicate that. And then on the philanthropy side, this is something that Bill Gates had said, that philanthropy has a role in the energy transition, and part of it, what philanthropy can do is to communicate to all these different constituents and stakeholders on what the opportunities are, so that we bring policymakers and the greater investment community to join in these efforts. And then finally, I think one idea that Charles and a colleague of ours have been floating around is this idea of a portfolio approach. How do we minimize risk by take a portfolio of various technologies from those which are well known, but also include those which are high risk, high return as part of this portfolio, so that we kind of have a rational approach to designing these types of financial vehicles.
And I just want to dovetail Frank's remarks, as it's very critical. Philanthropy is part of the solution, and many of you may have heard of donor-advised funds. This is a global investment vehicle where family offices and individuals of all types, high net worth and otherwise, can structure a donor-advised fund and invest according to their mission-driven goals. And that's another example of blended financing, when you can include donor-advised funds who are strictly structured, some 100% climate, some, I don't know anyone that's 100% nuclear energy, but maybe with education and after this panel, maybe there'll be a couple. But donor-advised funds, frankly, is the fastest growing structure in the investment space, given the growth of wealth globally, and not just the Western countries.
So yeah, request to the public, if you know a philanthropist who doesn't know about the investment opportunities in nuclear, please let us know. Guide us.
By the way, I'm doing a talk about that at 4 o'clock in the Blue Zone on Wednesday.
Yeah,
Philanthropy.
so we know how to manage.
Just a little promo there.
So we know how to manage the money. The next question to Elina. So we already touched a little bit on the International Bank of Nuclear Infrastructure in your intro, but could you tell more about it and how, let's say, nuclear newcomers can take advantage of this initiative, or how can we participate? Like, I'm speaking on behalf of Kazakhstan, let's say. Tell us more.
Yeah, absolutely. So a significant amount of infrastructure globally is financed by the World Bank and by other international financing institutions. Almost all of these institutions today exclude nuclear. There is no good scientific reason behind it. It is purely political, because there's a small contingent in those countries, in those institutions, in the members of those institutions that are pro-nuclear. And also, these institutions have never had experience financing nuclear. The World Bank financed one nuclear project in Italy in 1959. That's the first and last project they financed. But these organizations catalyze a huge amount, trillions, I'm not talking about billions, I'm talking about trillions of dollars of capital for renewables, for natural gas, for other infrastructure projects. And an idea was born about 2 years ago. Well, why don't we create this type of bank, but focus on financing nuclear? And now we're not just talking about reactors, because, to get to this 3 times of nuclear capacity that we have today, we're going to need supply chain investment, right? All of those reactors are going to need equipment, for which we currently don't have factories to produce the equipment. We're going to need fuel. We're going to have costs around spent fuel management. Newcomer countries that don't have infrastructure are going to need to develop regulatory bodies, grid systems, pretty much everything around a nuclear power plant. So if we had a bank, basically a World Bank for nuclear, which is this infrastructure bank that we're developing, you could really catalyze the trillions and trillions of dollars of finance. So this concept today has been socialized with several dozen countries. Stakeholders within those countries, private industries, NGOs, lots of different people, and nobody has said that it is a bad idea. So that is a point of validation. And in fact, we've gotten letters of support from lots of different organizations to stand up this bank. So it's really on the way of happening. It is certainly ambitious, right? Standing up a new infrastructure bank is no small feat. But if you actually look at the history of establishment of these types of institutions, when there was political will, they got established in 2 to 3 years. Mm-hmm. So right now, we think we have the political will for nuclear among countries that have nuclear currently, but also among those that want to have nuclear, that currently don't, or want to expand their nuclear programs. So we're really hopeful that this institution will become a reality. It'll be a treaty organization. And importantly, it will do a lot of what we're talking about in the panel. It's not just about getting governments to invest dollars. It's investing that patient capital from governments to catalyze the trillions of dollars of dollars that are available for everything else today, but not for nuclear, right? So that's what we're hoping to do.
Fantastic. And I guess getting back on, we have the wheel, we have like ideas, we already kind of put together the structure. What can we learn from failed projects, like unsuccessful projects, to make sure that this initiative gets us where we want to be, and we get as much as homework done before we jump into new project? That's a general question for everyone.
Actually, if you don't mind, I can start on that one, because we actually some time ago somebody asked me that same question, and I said this is a really good question about how do projects fail, why do projects fail, right? So let's put together a chart of all the failed nuclear projects, and let's see why they failed. And I can tell you the answer of all the projects, about 80% failed because of financing, lack thereof. About 20% failed because of lack of political support, change of government, but the rest were all failures of financing. It was the government didn't have enough financing, or the private sector didn't have enough financing, or both. So really the lessons learned from the projects is that we need to structure projects at the start with financing in mind. Because what normally happens is that you have somebody have the idea of a project, there is a demand, there are stakeholders come together, they put together all the contracts, they hire lawyers who write the contracts, and then they go to the bankers, right? Because the bankers usually don't want to talk to you beforehand. And then the bankers say, sorry, this is not a bankable project. And then it's too late, right? So that's actually one of the purposes of IBNI, is that it would develop codes and standards to drive successful projects, but it also would be there at the very front end to try to help companies and governments structure projects in a successful way so that they actually succeed and they can attract external financing.
I'm going to, I'll jump in, and a full disclosure, I invest across the energy stack, including nuclear. And the failed projects across the energy stack, no surprise, is financing. And if you drive, and I'm also a middle market, meaning mid-sized company investment banker, exiting the company that I co-founded 7 years ago, Williams Capital, which highly successful company, largest women minority-owned investment bank today. I exited to focus on climate tech and fintech, and had to go down the capital stack, meaning leaving the private equity, robust middle market world, down to the land of venture capital, which is not as structured as private equity. But the good news is that there's significant interest in tech, and by the time I did it 7 years ago, the venture capital world I see is bifurcated. And so the blended finances that I was sharing earlier, patient capital combined, is really more of a private investment vehicle, not the traditional private equity, not the traditional venture capital, and something in between. So having, frankly, mentored founders, because I am one, I have been one, and it's not that much different speaking to anyone starting a project finance. I mean, that's a company. It has a P&L. One can't look at it any other way. So it is you are founders in the project financing world, and there are basic fundamentals of starting companies. There's a lot of first-time founder mistakes that happen all the time. So I don't have a secret sauce, but I do. There are frameworks for founders. There are frameworks for projects, including nuclear. I mean, honestly, nuclear, the framework for energy project financing is very similar. And the good news is that there are now tools to help founders start from the beginning. Every banker who's really seriously interested in advancing climate tech and climate investment funds, they're not the traditional bankers. They do want to be involved early. And there's, quite frankly, a number of firms, large and small, that specialize in it. So I'm very excited about this decade. And I think the biggest difference today that didn't exist before is technology. And I absolutely believe that technology is frankly one of the key missing ingredients when we think about scalability combined with finance and nuclear energy.
So I'll just add a couple quick notes. So MIT came out with a study, The Future of Nuclear, a few years ago, and in one of their conclusions of why nuclear had gone so expensive was a lack of regulatory consistency or priorities, and also the fact that what they learned from the Korean and the French examples were that if you develop nuclear power plants, specifically in the context of large power plants, that you have the same process for fabricating and construction, then the costs come down much cheaper. So as Dail had point about the role of technology, is that we should explore other options like SMRs or even microreactors that potentially could be fabricated in a 3D print shop and then shipped and be scaled in a much more modular fashion than the current large type of reactors, which could be one way to get around the costs here.
Charles, question for you. As an investor, experienced, seasoned investor from Silicon Valley, so we just touched the question about technology, SMR, and other types of things related to nuclear. What do you think you would invest? Like, if you had unlimited funds, what technology you think would succeed, and you want to invest right now and want everyone to motivate to invest more?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I have technology and software background, and a way that you do a startup is the fastest cycles with the newest technology, with the most iterations. And when I came over to nuclear and want to promote it with the family name and look at what the biggest problems are, and my background in venture investing, I found that's not what I was drawn to, where it just seems like there is capital going in on the venture side already that's handled. I mean, I think it's an important problem, but it seems like the big gap is not that sector of investment. It's bringing those, including existing reactors, to your failure point. The best thing that you can do for these large projects is redo the same thing over and over and learn exactly from the previous project. What did you learn? And get it 40% cheaper. So I found myself seeing a big space for large projects and bring infrastructure and venture investment. And even though I don't have the background in that, I'm making friends who do and coalesce capital around chasing large projects. The smaller, newer groups of SMRs, there's amazing new technology in the pipeline, but I think those are also 5 and 10 years out. And to get to net zero, we need a portfolio of large projects now with proven technology and new projects with new technology.
Frank, you touched a little bit on the policy making and the lack of structured policy and regulations around nuclear. So can you elaborate or start a little bit on what areas in policy making, specific areas that we need to advance to make sure that nuclear development gets enough support?
Yeah, I would say on the policy side, it's education awareness, right? I think there's still a lack of awareness in terms of what the opportunities are, especially if you're talking to, say, the political class, how they vote for supporting these technologies. So I would emphasize it's not just about climate, but also about energy security and economic opportunities. And I think those are the ways, at least politically, to get support. But at the same time, with kind of the scientific policy making, we also need to figure out ways how to communicate that better to the public so that we also get public support at the same time.
Anything to add? Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the issues with policy is that, my husband laughs at me because I use this phrase a lot. It's been a whack-a-mole sort of game. Yeah. It's like every time I hear you talk on the phone, you talk about the whack-a-mole, I'm like, that's because it is, right? We find one specific problem and we just really focus on it, like HALO. Right? I mean, for years we talked about we're going to need the high assay low enriched uranium for advanced reactors, and then now we're only going to focus on that problem, or we're going to focus on one part of the regulation, only that issue. But nuclear, if you look at what it takes to actually develop a nuclear program or any one specific project, there are about 20 different things that go into it, right? It's the financing, it's the licensing, it's an environmental impact assessment, it's the public acceptance. So we need to think about policies holistically, and that's where I think is missing. You really need to think about, okay, what are the pieces that today are keeping this industry from getting to 3x, right? For example, in the US, we have all the utilities saying, yes, we want nuclear, but we don't want to be the first.
Yeah.
What is needed to get them to be the first, not the third and fourth and fifth, right? They need an incentive. They need, you need other incentives for off-takers that are currently not in the nuclear industry. So we need to think about holistically what's missing, and that's for me, the missing piece.
True, and when we talk about, we increase nuclear, like triple nuclear, we a little bit forget that the workforce doesn't develop as fast as we want the nuclear to develop. So I think that's where we're missing a little bit on planning, long-term planning and policy structure. So I think that's a very good point to think holistically where we will need to cover the needs in the next 5-10 years, regardless.
And can I just make one point on the workforce? I think it's a really interesting one, especially for newcomer countries. What I've seen is that you have so many newcomer countries, they have such long development timelines, they actually start developing the workforce, and then the workforce leaves because there's nothing for them to do, right? So that also has to be part of the planning. You have to have something for the workforce to do so that they don't go elsewhere.
True. I'm one of those workforce. Okay, the next question, I guess, talking more about the newcomers, and I think how can we assure lenders to invest in particular area or particular region, taking into account all the challenges we have with currency that might be having hyperinflation at some point, how we work with those areas, especially in global south, in developing world. Can you start the conversation?
I'm going to really dovetail, frankly, what Elina just said, because as she was speaking about the holistic approach, that is the approach with the emerging countries in particular. And as I said at the beginning of our panel, what happened, Saturday was an example of emerging countries having a seat at the table when they heretofore did not. So I'm not a policy person, but I do think the framework now exists for emerging countries to communicate, whereas before that wasn't the case, and uranium's a prime example of as an element coming in and being mined and not factoring in the impact on the individuals and communities. We recognize certainly the licensing element. Many emerging countries aren't staffed to go through that process and rely on the developed countries too. There is a gap there. I don't have a lot of solutions about filling the education gap, but I do think the framework now exists where at least leaders in emerging countries and all stakeholders are being asked or at least have an opportunity to speak, and hopefully that will address part of the issue.
I think there could be an opportunity right now with this recent announcement and reclassification of gathering up some capital in an international fund that specifically is coming from multiple countries, which promotes cooperation, and then deploying it in the countries that are most likely to be able to build faster. That's not necessarily the United States. So that's an exciting prospect. We just said we're going to triple energy. We've got 5 or 10 countries. I've thought about flying around to those countries and say, all right, how much would you like to put in a global fund? So that's an idea.
And I've started to do a little work in Africa and India, frankly, and those are the regions I was thinking about when I referred seat at the table. Not being staffed on the licensing side as much as the developed countries, and the opportunity that we spoke about before in terms of blended financing, in terms of whether it's a government or whether it's a donor-advised fund or any other endowment and foundation, and there are some certainly with specific mission-focused investment tools, taking the risk off the table by some percentage of the first loan loss. I mean, this is the opportunity to address that hasn't been addressed before in terms of financing in these regions.
Yeah, maybe three things around that question. The first thing is that you want to mitigate risks in the project. Like you mentioned, if you go into a developing economy, you're going to potentially have more political risk, you will have more currency risk. So the idea is do not add more risks to something that's already a risky project, right? A proven technology may be a better solution to, a country that has other risks. Bringing in somebody who can actually execute the project, right? One of the reasons the project here in the UAE was successful is they said, we want a vendor that has done the same thing over and over again somewhere else, and we want them to do it the end time here. So that's why they signed the contract with Korea. They could have chosen other technologies, and then maybe they would have been successful with those, but they said, we're a newcomer country. We have one person in this country that has a nuclear education. We have to build an entire infrastructure, so let's not add more risk. That's the first thing. The second thing is that typically nuclear projects are kind of approached in a vacuum. Each country just does its own thing. But if we're talking about 3 times nuclear, to Dail's point, we really have to think about how do we band together and create these order books of projects, and how do we transfer some of the lessons learned, right, from project to project. So that's one way that countries in the developing world could team up with countries that are more mature, that have project development experience, and do it all in parallel so that project development experience is shared. And then third point, as I mentioned, almost every single energy infrastructure project in the developing world is financed by the World Bank or one of the regional banks in very difficult countries, and it's done despite the currency risk, despite the political risk. They get these projects done. So if we had a bank that could do that for nuclear, I think that would be a big change.
Fantastic.
So I actually live in Japan, and so I know there's been much increase of activity over the past year in terms of U.S.-Japan collaboration for nuclear technologies, but it's also in the context of providing these technologies to Southeast Asia and other countries, which are still at the beginning of stages of urbanization and industrialization. So I know at these COP meetings there's always tension between development and decarbonization. And so this presents a big opportunity to develop some of these new technology, but deploy it and help. I think the term they use is leapfrog over the types of development that the OECD countries have led, but to help them leapfrog over that and go directly to decarbonize the economy while developing at the same time. So that would be the big opportunity we see in collaborating across these regions.
Thank you so much. Well, we have to wrap up, but thank you so much, our speakers. Everyone brought a very unique perspective, and on my side, I wanted really to emphasize the success of UAE and Baraka power plant, because this was one of the projects that really showed something in nuclear can be built on time, on budget, and we can prepare the task force, we can prepare the project of such complexity, and that gives a lot of hope for the rest of the communities, the rest of the countries that want to have nuclear but always thought, oh, that's developed country technology and too risky, too expensive. And there are so many mechanisms already, so many opportunities to finance it, and I hope this panel demystified some of the things about nuclear financing. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, our panelists.
Thank you. Thank you, Dinara, our nuclear engineer on the panel.